Sunday service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Vero Beach. I am Kate Wensing, your pulpit host this morning, and we are so glad that you have chosen to be with us. We are a traditional brick and mortar congregation located at the corner of 16th Street and 27th Avenue in the city of Vero Beach, Florida. We serve the Treasure Coast, and we are also an inclusive and progressive virtual congregation without walls that embraces and serves people from all over the United States and world who access us by the internet. Please know that you are welcome just as you come to us in all of your human particularity and charm, whether you are young or old, gay or straight, black or white, or some other wonderful shade of humanity. Whether you are a visitor this morning or have been a member of our congregation for decades, whether you are feeling on top of the world, down in the dumps, or somewhere in between, we are delighted to have you with us this morning. We hope that you will find this service meaningful and enriching, and that you will find something here this morning that nourishes your spirit and feeds your soul and gives you renewed energy and joy for the living of life in the days and weeks ahead. So welcome. I have a few announcements to bring to your attention before we begin our service this morning. One, the Fair Trade Corner is open today at the conclusion of this service. Next Sunday, Scott Alexander will host our affiliate minister, Reverend Sarah York, whose topic is The Shadow Knows. By taking time to claim the shadow side of our own human nature, we are empowered to confront the unacceptable behavior in others. Another announcement, UU Service Committee raised over $3,000 for our Guest at Your Table collection. Of this amount, 2,700 qualified for matching grants from the Shelter Rock congregation in New York. And Jack Stiefel and Andrew Sorbo would like to heartily thank everyone who contributed to this good cause. We do also have Martin Luther King Jr. refrigerator magnets available at the entrance outside here. The magnets say, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." And our last announcement is that the Gifford Historical Museum is hosting at Raw Space an exhibition by Dr. Terry Hunter's art students, and it's called The Grid Comes Full Circle. And with that, I would like to begin our service with our introit, I Have a Dream.
I have a dream that all can live as equals.
I have a dream that we shall overcome. I have a dream our destinies are interlocked. May we share in his dream and work to make it real. I have a dream that we will win our freedom. I have a dream that victory will be ours. I have a dream the disenchanted will prevail. May we share in his dream and to make it real. I have a dream that love can transform evil. I have a dream, a vision of world peace. I have a dream that all will join in freedom's song. May we share in his dream and work to make it real.
Good morning. Our opening words are from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, in which we are called to remember that we are not, as the poet John Donne wrote, an island entire unto ourselves, but part of a community that swells from our hometown to our nation, and today encompasses the whole world. Here are his words. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Please rise in body or spirit and join us in our opening hymn. Lift every voice and sing verses 1 and 3.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day.
sorry, okay. And now, Andrew and Johnny May will kindle the chalice flame.
Excuse me. As Johnny May lights the chalice, please join me in saying these words by Martin Luther King Jr. Violence merely increases hate, returning violence for violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that.
Chalice, chalice, burning bright, help remind us with your light of how we'd like to live each day, with love and truth helping lead the way.
Sorry about that. Nature will have its way.
It's too much,
Okay,
it's too wet.
it's, yeah. Here, light it from here. Yeah,
Get that chalice lit yet?
yes, it is. Our story for all ages today is a short video recap of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. But before we start, I have a question for everyone here. Can anyone tell us what Martin Luther King Jr.'s name was before he changed it at the age of 28 on his birth certificate? Okay. Well, you can still take a magnet when you leave. And so can the rest of you. I didn't really know this either until I started doing some research. He was born Michael King, Jr., son of Michael King, Sr. This was in 1929. In 1934, as a little boy, his father decided to go on a religious, we might say a religious pilgrimage, and which took him eventually to Berlin, Germany. And when he was in Germany, he read a lot and visited a lot of the places where Martin Luther had lived and studied and worked and sought refuge, and decided that he was going to change his name to Martin Luther King. And he gave the same name then to his son. So he became Martin Luther King Sr., and the man we know as Martin Luther King Jr. became who we know him as. But he didn't officially change his name on his birth certificate until he was 28. I tell you that because there's a lot of things in this video that you're going to learn about. One of the other things I should have mentioned is that when he was in Germany in 1934, Hitler had taken power just the year before. And Michael King Sr. saw what was happening there and the condemnation of and vilification of Jews stuck in his mind. And you can imagine what he thought about that and related it to our own country. So please enjoy the video.
Martin Luther King Jr. was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the civil rights movement from 1954 until his death in 1968. King was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. When King was a child, he really enjoyed singing and music and often sang with his church choir. King suffered from depression through much of his life. In his adolescent years, he initially felt resentment against whites due to the racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. At the age of 12, shortly after his maternal grandmother died, King blamed himself and jumped out of a second-story window, but survived. King attended Booker T. Washington High School. He became known for his public speaking ability and was part of the school's debate team. When King was 13 years old, he became the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal. 2 years later, King passed the exam and entered Morehouse. In 1948, King graduated at the age of 19 from Morehouse with a BA in sociology. He then enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, from which he graduated with a B.Div degree in 1951. While attending Crozer, King was joined by Walter McCall, a former classmate at Morehouse. At Crozer, King was elected president of the student body. 5 years later, King married Coretta Scott. They became the parents of 4 children. King began doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University and received his PhD degree on June 5, 1955. While pursuing doctoral studies, King worked as an assistant minister at Boston's historic 12th Baptist Church. In 1957, King and other civil rights activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The group was created to harness the moral authority and organizing power of black churches to conduct nonviolent protests in the service of civil rights reform. King organized and led marches for blacks' right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. Most of these rights were successfully enacted into the law of the United States with the passage of Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In April 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began a campaign against racial segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. However, King was arrested and jailed early in the campaign. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the March on Washington, or the Great March on Washington, was held in Washington, D.C. in August 1963. The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. At the march, King gave his most famous speech, "I Have a Dream." It was considered as one of the finest speeches in the history of American oratory. After his years of historic accomplishments and triumphs, King was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. His active and dynamic leadership, highlighted by his nonviolent tactics, helped him earn the prize. Receiving the award was a testament that nonviolence was the best method in achieving peace and equality. At 35, King was the youngest man to ever receive the prize. Bloody Sunday in 1965 was a major turning point in the effort to gain public support for the civil rights movement. It was the clearest demonstration up to that time of the dramatic potential of King's nonviolent strategy. A few days later, King attempted to organize a march. At the conclusion of the march, King delivered a speech that became known as "How Long, Not Long." In it, King stated that equal rights for African Americans could not be far away. The Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and Al Rabiwas, was regarded as the most ambitious civil rights campaign in the north of the United States. King was long opposed to American involvement in the Vietnam War because it took money and resources that could have been spent on social welfare at home. In 1968, King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized the Poor People's Campaign to address the issues of economic justice. The campaign demanded economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. He began to more frequently express his opposition to the war and his desire to see a redistribution of resources to correct racial and economic injustice. Later that year, King went to Memphis, Tennessee in support of the black sanitary public works employees. King was fatally shot by James Earl Ray on April 4, 1968, as he stood on the motel's second-floor balcony at the Lorraine Motel. Despite emergency chest surgery, King died at St. Joseph's Hospital. The assassination led to a nationwide wave of race riots in many big cities in the United States. The King assassination riots, also known as the Holy Week Uprising, was a wave of civil disturbance which swept the United States. It was the greatest wave of social unrest the United States had experienced since the Civil War. King made significant contributions to the civil rights all around the world in general and in the United States in particular. He worked hard to promote the equal treatment of all race. His nonviolent approach to protesting and his true belief in the ability of mankind to live in peace went a long way toward advancement of civil rights. King was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a holiday in numerous cities and states beginning in 1971. The holiday was enacted at the federal level by legislation signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. Hundreds of streets in the U.S. have been renamed in his honor. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe.
Sorry. Now is the time in our service for the members and friends of our fellowship to express their financial commitment to the ongoing work in which the congregation shares. Every Sunday, we collect donations for a worthy community service organization here on the Treasure Coast, which we have selected. This morning's organization to be supported is the Gifford Community and Cultural Resource Center, which is run by Johnny May Perry. If you wish to make a donation to them, please make a check out to UUFVB with GCCRC on the memo line and mail it into our office. Twice a year, we mail them a check for the full amount donated. We would also remind all members and friends of our congregation, whether you are attending this morning or watching us on the internet, that UUFVB needs your continuing and faithful financial generosity. You can either click on the Donate tab found in the upper right-hand corner of our website or mail a check to our offices at 1590 27th Avenue. If you notify us, our bookkeeper can also automatically charge pledges and contributions to a credit card or bank account of your choice. Thank you for your generous support. And this morning's collection is now taken. And as co-chair of the 2021-22 Stewardship Campaign, I am co-chair with Rebecca Hornbuckle, our treasurer. I would like to introduce Leon Sterl and Hector Cruz, who will be talking to you about why they are members of this congregation.
Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day to celebrate the great man that fought for peace and liberty to everyone in this country and the world. Being say that, my name is Hector Cruz, and I'm very glad and happy that I am a member of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Vero Beach. I have a small, pretty good story to tell you. The story is one night on 2017, I was on the Kilter Mermaid Bar and restaurant, ready to play drag bingo. I think few don't know. Maureen knows about it. I won't say any more about that. At the same that night, I met a lovely lady named Faye Shapor. And lo and behold, she invited me to come to church on Sunday and was the Unitarian Universalist of Vero Beach. I did say yes, and here we are, speaking in front of all of you, which is, I'm not shaking. My nose is not running, thank God. Sorry for the neck. Have you ever seen one of these lately? Not too many people use them anymore. You know? I'm an old-fashioned guy. What can I tell you? But the best part is that the church and Emerson are the same. Saying that, I was there once to see a great show, the Twin Brothers. Which was a great show. I had a wonderful time. And then down the road, that let it down in 2008, no, 17? 18? Yeah. I'll get a number, it's a name. I met this wonderful man named Leon. And, I met him in a cocktail party for single people. Wonderful. Okay, no sooner that a couple of weeks later, or a couple of months later, he came and joined the choir, Leon. Now, we love coming here every Sunday. It is like our second home, and having lots of sisters and brothers. We are any further notice, I guess you know Leon. Take it away. I'm finished, thank God.
Shortly after I met Hector, he told me that he sang in the choir at the UUFEB. So I came here for the first time on a November Sunday before Thanksgiving in 2018. There were lots of amazing things that happened that day, like meeting Maureen Glennon and Jean Panuto at the welcome desk, hearing Reverend Scott welcome each and every one with their unique human peculiarities, and taking a red coffee mug in the social hall after the service. But I have three particular reactions that I had that morning that I would like to emphasize today. The first one is open minds, loving hearts, helping hands. What an amazing description of the UU members. It's because of that Hector and I can come here and be ourselves without hiding or pretending to be something different. We sincerely thank you all for that. The second thing is the 7 principles that are the foundations of UU. Having no religious background growing up, I had to figure out on my own what set of principles I would live by. That November morning, I realized that I've been a UU all my life. Those 7 principles summarized how I had been living my life all along, and I'm finally home. And the third thing, I heard Reverend Scott refer to this building as the Emerson Center. My full name is Leon Emerson Sterling. Emerson is my middle name. So how's that for spectacular cosmic coincidence? And finally, Hector and I will always be here because of the warm, welcoming spirit that makes this congregation a family. Thank you, take care, and be safe.
And one other announcement, Rebecca would like to add to our thank you list of people who donated for this building the name of Bonnie Pendleton, who was mistakenly left off of the thank you list last week. Now is our time for community connections. Because we are a caring community, each Sunday during our worship, we take a few moments to share the joys and sorrows and prayers that are on our hearts. At this point, Paula Herger is still in continued treatment and would appreciate any thoughts and prayers that you have for her. Our joys this week are birthdays: Georgianne Callandine, Sally Wilson, Marty Deaning, I don't know if I'm saying that right, sorry. Marion Vrusho, Pat Warner, and Phyllis Hall. So I will place stones in the water as we sing Spirit of Life. You may at home call to your hearts and minds those persons for whom you are sending out your love this morning. Let our ritual of love and connection begin.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow with the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Whose holy close wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Today, instead of a traditional sermon, you'll be hearing from Johnny May Perry, Skylar Fitzcoy, who is not able to attend services, but did create a short video, so you'll get to see him and hear his words, and myself, about our reflections on Martin Luther King Jr. In this past year, when race has been such a painful issue, it is good for us to reflect on the life of a true national hero. So it's my pleasure to ask Johnny May to come up and deliver her remarks now.
And good morning to everyone. I am humbled to have this opportunity of being part of this very significant recognition of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday celebration. After Andrew asked me to speak for a few minutes, I immediately thought of the Black church and what it meant to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. Three words kept coming to mind: faith, love, and hope. Dr. Martin Luther King represents and represented faith, love, and hope, not only to the Negro and oppressed people everywhere. He represented faith, love, and hope to our nation for an inclusive America. As a child, growing up in Gifford, I remember my home, my grandparents' home, uncles and aunts, and each home I visited had something in common: a framed picture of Dr. Martin Luther King hanging on the wall. It was usually one of the first things you saw when you entered these homes. As a young child, I knew he was a symbol of love and hope and served as a beacon to oppressed people. He gave hope for a better life to the Negroes. My parents had faith. They had faith his ministry would bring about equality and acceptance of Black people in America. We had faith in his dream. We still have faith in his dream. Martin Luther King was the son of a Baptist preacher, Daddy King we called him, who I might add came to Gifford on December 2nd, 1979, to speak at St. Peter's Baptist Church for their annual Men's Day observance. And if you know anything about the Black church, once a year, we always had a Men's Day celebration and a Women's Day celebration. Daddy King had been invited by his friend, then pastor of St. Peter's, Reverend Tom Diamond. I was told by several members of the church that was present at that service, Daddy King said to the congregation, "I know y'all thought I wasn't coming." Dr. Martin Luther King grew up in a house of faith, a home of faith. And in his ministry, he knew his journey was bigger than himself. He relied heavily on the systematic analysis of the Christian concept of love. In his weekly remarks as president of the Resistance Committee, he said, "The use of violence in our struggle would be both unpractical and immoral. To meet hate, with retaliatory hate would do nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. He said, we must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. We must meet physical force with soul free. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. Dr. King believed in agape love. Agape is not a weak, passive love. It is love in action. Agape is a love seeking to preserve and create community. If you harm me, you harm yourself. His beliefs laid the foundation for his teachings of nonviolence. Dr. King's last speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on August 16, 1967, was titled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" And he said, in order to answer that question, we must first honestly respond and ask ourselves, where are we now? In the 50s and 60s, Dr. King was fighting for equality and justice for the Negro in every stage of their lives. Then, half of our blacks live in substandard housing. Then, blacks had half the income of whites. Then, the rate of infant mortality was double that of whites. Then, in elementary schools, black children lagged 1 to 3 years behind, and the black schools received less money per child than white schools. Then, there were twice as much unemployment of blacks than whites. Then King said, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. King led marches, went to jail, was beaten, and died for a fair, equal, just America for his race, the human race also. Then, the fight for the Negro was the Voting Rights Act, criminal justice, police brutality, fair wages, and poverty. Where do we go from here? Where are we now? Today, January 18, 2021, we are still fighting to eradicate systemic racism from our society. Showing up as disparities in education, the school-to-prison pipeline is threatening the fabric of our American society by placing an emphasis on black children entering into the criminal justice system for minor offenses. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, describes the pipeline as funneling of students out of school and into the streets, and the juvenile correction system perpetuates a cycle known as the school-to-prison pipeline, which deprives black children and youth of meaningful opportunities for education and future employment. Today, 2021, there is unequal treatment in the healthcare system, according to a report of the Institute of Medical Medicine on Racial and Ethnic Disparities, which this pandemic has also highlighted. Disparities in the criminal justice system, unequal standards of justice for blacks and minorities have created a prison population that is overwhelming blacks and Hispanics. The unequal treatment of minorities in the criminal justice system is one of the most serious problems facing America in the new millennium, said by Clarence Dunaville Jr., an American lawyer and civil rights activist. Today, police brutality is rampant. Just say their name. Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Arteria Woods, Corey Jones, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, a child, a 12-year-old boy with a toy gun, and so many other lives taken by police in unarmed situations. Where do we go from here? We tell the truth, acknowledge historical injustices. Systemic racism is a problem in America. Today, start where you are. Silence is no longer an option. Silence is complicity. Why do you fear my color? Let's turn that fear into a positive. F, be the first to make a commitment to do the work to make a difference. E, educate yourself in the fight to eradicate systemic racism in any form. A, advocate for equity and equality for all and take action. And R, read books on anti-racism. Reverse your course. Open your consciousness to respect and honor our differences. Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, wrote, I think we have to own the fears that we have of each other, and then in some practical way, some daily way, figure out how to see people differently than the way we were brought up. I think today, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say, Black lives matter too. Turn your fear of my color into love and understanding of my being. Thank you, and God bless America.
Hello, and good morning. My name's Skylar, and I'm here to share my personal perspective on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before I begin, let me share some information about myself so you understand how I've come to see MLK. First, I'm the child of immigrants. My upbringing was filled with love, laughter, struggle, and success. I was taught that anything worth having in life is only gained through work. And finally, my parents also believed in the philosophy of work smarter, not harder. I grew up with great role models and other historical figures I was meant to aspire to. The peak of these historical figures was none other than MLK. For clarification, I use the abbreviation MLK not to diminish the man, but I use it intentionally because this man's life has been elevated beyond that of a mere mortal. Those three letters rightfully have such power and reverence surrounding them that he has now become a brand and a symbol of hope. When Andrew first asked me to share my perspective on MLK today, I had to sit down and reflect. Not just on who I am today and how I feel, but also how it felt as a young black child in school, learning about MLK in class. So today, I'll be traveling back and forth through time. I'll speak about then, how I received this information in school, for better and for sometimes worse. I'll also speak about now, the information I learned outside of school, which has formed my current thoughts. So, I'm going to go ahead and open up a PowerPoint, which is going to demonstrate my thoughts and feelings both then and now. So, then, I was taught that Martin Luther King was a singular champion in the fight for racial justice. He did this without the help of any other people. His focus and dedication was so unique that it'd be difficult for other people to replicate. Now I know he was never a solo act. I mean, have you seen any picture of Martin Luther King Jr.? Every picture, he's never working alone. He is just one voice in the sea of many, putting in the hard work. Then I was taught he was an acceptable activist because he protested the, quote, right way. Now I know denial of justice has nothing to do with people's protest methods. It mostly has to do with the appearance of the messenger. Then I was taught that MLK was a beloved American figure, loved by all, respected by all. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was on the cover of Time magazine, etc. Now I know he was not. Every alphabet organization had some measure of surveillance on him. The FBI, the CIA, the NSA, etc. Even the chief of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, called Martin Luther King Jr. the most notorious liar in the country. Imagine if we had that quote today. Even other civil rights activists disagreed publicly and loudly, like Malcolm X did when it came to Martin Luther King Jr. Then I was taught that MLK only focused on issues of race. In 1963, he had a dream, and he was killed in 1968. But something was left out that always bothered me. What happened to MLK during that 5-year period? What was he focusing on? What was he fighting for? Now I know MLK cared about ending injustice for all peoples, no matter their shade. He was one of the many voices that started the Poor People's Campaign, which focused on the plight of rural whites, urban blacks, migrants, and even indigenous peoples. In fact, about indigenous peoples, MLK says the following: "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there are large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. We are perhaps the only nation which has tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated this tragic experience into a noble crusade. And this is the letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. I also now know that MLK opposed the Vietnam War, which is going to cause friction with one of his political allies, President Johnson, who was a large proponent of this war. Then I was taught the fight for civil rights ended in a rousing success. I mean, we all sing Kumbaya together. We don't have, in America, those separate colored fountains or segregated buses anymore. So things must be better, right? Now I know my overall takeaway is best described by the Spanish philosopher George Santayana. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And unfortunately, in the United States, we tend to focus more on events that make us feel heroic. So, the man versus the legend. Martin Luther King Jr., the man, is a great historical figure. The legend of Martin Luther King Jr. is also a titan of racial justice. The man, Martin Luther King Jr., has been elevated to the rightful pedestal of granite and marble. However, the message he was preaching has mostly been ignored because we in America do not like to linger on unpleasant feelings. And it appears as though the lessons of MLK have been papered over because otherwise we might see the cracks in the foundation that is America. And the American past, just like the American present, is filled with these examples of unpleasantness. But I do want to end on something positive. We can continue the great work of MLK and all those other unnamed champions in the fight against injustice. And we can do this with 5 basic ideas. Number 1, all people have dignity and worth. And for the you faithful, this should seem very familiar. We have to realize that people who disagree with us are not the enemy. Some of the best ideas can in fact come from people with a different perspective. Number 2, we must be in service to other people. This is all about working towards the greater good for all. Number 3, equity and equality are not the same. If a historically downtrodden group is improving, this doesn't mean that other groups are now, quote, losing. It just means those without power merely want the fewest number of barriers in their path. Number 4, compromise is not a dirty word. If there's a negotiation and any group walks away feeling happy, then you've had a failed negotiation. Because the group that has, quote, lost is now going to feel resentment towards the, quote, winning group. In any negotiation, all groups need to leave the table going, I guess that's okay, or maybe I can live with that. And the final idea, anything worth having requires hard work. This means that doing something to improve is much better than stagnating just because it's comfortable. We must be willing to push past that initial discomfort of something new and try something different. I'd like to end now with a quote from the late John Lewis. For a refresher, he was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from 1963 to 1966 as a college student. In 1965, he led the first march from Selma to Montgomery, which became known as Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama when the state police attacked. peaceful protesters. In 2018, he's quoted as saying, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful and optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." I'd like to thank you for my time, and I'll see you guys later.
Our anthem today is entitled "I Dream a World," and it was written by Andre Thomas, and it was a dedication actually for 9/11, and it's a poem by Langston Hughes that he set to music, and Langston Hughes, as many of you probably know, was a Black poet. I Dream a World.
Of such I dream, of such I dream,
Of such I dream, of such I dream, of such I dream. I dream a world where man,
no other man will scorn,
where love will bless the earth,
and peace its paths adorn.
I dream.
a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul,
Nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. Of such I dream, of such I dream, of such I dream, of such I dream, of such I dream. Where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind.
of such I dream,
Of such I dream.
Of such I dream.
I dream a world.
Beautiful selection, Elizabeth. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King delivered his most famous speech before a huge throng at the Lincoln Memorial. His most iconic line from that speech, which you all have heard many times, is, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." He expressed a noble dream to share with us that day, but he also had a warning. Referring to the Emancipation Proclamation signed by the president on whose memorial he was standing, Martin Luther King Jr. reminded the audience, quote, "But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty amidst a vast ocean of material prosperity," unquote. At that time, as Johnny May Perry told us earlier, black people had far less family wealth than white Americans, could expect to live shorter lives, were denied equal opportunities in education, were forced into the back of public transportation, denied the right to vote in large sections of our country, held a disproportionate percentage of menial jobs, were forced by redlining restrictions to live only in designated areas of most of our cities, north and south, and had never, in the almost 200-year history of our country, seen a person who was not white sit in the Oval Office or on the bench of the Supreme Court. Just 4 months earlier than that speech, he was imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama, for peacefully demonstrating against racial injustice. He wrote his plea to the nation and revealed to the world his disappointment in our people, including his liberal supporters, for not understanding the need for swift and serious action. We shouldn't forget that he was also talking, at that time, to the white liberal Kennedy administration when he wrote these words in his letter. "I have been greatly disappointed with the white moderate. The Negro's great stumbling block is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, the absence of tension, to a positive peace, the presence of justice, who is more devoted to order than justice, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will," unquote. President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, we now know, were very much concerned with the way that King and his fellow civil rights leaders were pushing the federal government to act and not just issue statements of support. And they were concerned about the political risk they would be taking to intervene in the South to stand up for the legal rights of black people, causing, as John Lewis later said, good trouble, unquote. Interestingly, I chose this photo to include in these remarks several days before there was a notice in the New York Times just 2 days ago of a new movie coming out. It won't be in theaters, you'll have to see it online if you want. It's called MLK/FBI. And of course, you probably recognize who's in the middle there. That is J. Edgar Hoover. And you heard what J. Edgar Hoover said about Martin Luther King from Schuyler's comments. Despite the civil rights laws passed soon after by the Johnson administration and his own leadership for nonviolent struggle that was so successful in helping to remove the insulting and demeaning Jim Crow era laws, Martin Luther King had become a much less revered figure by the time he was murdered in April 1968. His stand against the Vietnam War earned him great hatred, as did his insistence that it was not enough to allow the Negro to sit at any lunch counter if he could not afford to buy a lunch there. When he was killed in Memphis, he was leading a poor people's campaign to fight for decent wages, fighting to get his people, our fellow citizens, off that island of poverty and into that vast sea of prosperity. Only then, as he pointed out in his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, would the Negro be satisfied. But this was asking for too much from the white majority, too threatening, and at the youthful age of 39, he was murdered. He did, we like euphemisms in this country. He died. He was killed. Well, people can be killed falling off a building. This was murder. Here is the title of an article from the Smithsonian Magazine dated 2018. It points out just how unpopular Dr. King was when he was killed. In 1968, the unpopular Vietnam War was still raging, but Dr. King had shifted his fight to that of poorly paid sanitation workers in Memphis. What was the connection? Let's take a look at some of his own words so that we can see. Was Dr. King correct about his assessment of the situation? Think about it. The military budget this year, 2021, will be almost, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, $1 trillion. It's 900 and something billion. Very close. If you round it off, if you do math, you round off to the closest large number. And it's $1 trillion, which is greater than the next 10 countries combined. Was the money spent on the Vietnam War and the lives lost worth it? What was gained? Was Dr. King correct that the Vietnam War, which we lost, killed the chances of the war on poverty to be successful? These were questions that Dr. King focused on in his last years. Were he still alive, what would he have to say to us today? Where would he stand on some of the critical issues of our day? Let's look at more of his words in his letter from that Birmingham prison to search for appropriate clues. He stated further along in his letter that, quote, "History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals might see the light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals." Groups are more immoral than individuals, unquote. Niebuhr was a great moral philosopher and theologian many of us seniors read in college years ago. The point Martin Luther King and Niebuhr were making, that groups are more immoral than individuals, should be clear to everyone living today as we watched the hatred exhibited by mobs on our television screens a week or so ago. Here we can see a Nazi rally from just before World War II. The nation of Germany and the world turned its gaze away, and the forces of evil were emboldened. In Charlottesville in 2017, that's the two pictures diagonal, right-wing extremist and white supremacist groups were met with a slap on the wrist. Good people on both sides? Really? We even heard our leaders say that. Just 11 days ago, we saw the emboldened extremists and hate mongers storm our most sacred symbol of working democracy. Would Martin Luther King have not warned us in 2017 that something was very wrong in our country and been leading the condemnation of the coddling of hateful actions? What would he have felt seeing Confederate flags carried proudly through the halls of Congress? I feel certain that were he alive today, he would be very, very saddened that 52 years after his death, racism and white supremacy are making a terrifically powerful resurgence. Last spring, we saw weeks of protest across the country, almost entirely free of violence. The media, of course, shows the violent clips, the violent 5%, in response to the murder of George Floyd. For that is what we saw as we watched the infamous 8.5 minutes of tape happening before our eyes. These protests were met with threats from our president to start the shooting and claims of left-wing and communist extremist violence that would make our beautiful suburbs unsafe. But Martin Luther King knew firsthand about police violence against peaceful but loudly vocal black protesters. Listen to further words he wrote from jail. Quote, "When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will find it easier to understand why we find it difficult to wait," unquote. Is it a stretch to rephrase Martin Luther King's words, a degenerating sense of nobodiness, into Black Lives Matter? That black folks are not nobodies and that their lives matter as much as white bodies? I wonder what Martin Luther King would have said over the last decade as political and religious leaders offered nothing but prayers and more prayers every time a black man, woman, or even children as young as Tamir Rice, 12 years old, were shot, sometimes in the back, and killed by the police. Well, we don't have to wonder, because his letter reads very prophetically, quote, "In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the side and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities," unquote. What would he say today, that the same behavior has continued for a half-century after his own murder? This past year, we witnessed a proliferation of discussions and the publication of numerous best-selling books on the topics of systemic racism and white privilege. Many white Americans are finally coming to recognize the existence of these two factors throughout our history. Many wonder why they weren't taught about this in school. Why were we not taught about redlining in cities across the country, of the numerous race riots like the ones in Tulsa and Chicago, where armed whites, aided by the police, attacked whole sections of our cities crammed densely with black people who were not allowed to live wherever they wanted? Why were we not taught about how our unions would not allow black people to join? Why lynchings were pervasive not just in the South and were occasions for celebration and the production of postcard souvenirs? Here is what Martin Luther King had to say about systemic racism before the phrase was coined. Quote, "I am sure none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes," unquote. He followed that with his comment, quote, "We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and it was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany, unquote. Any conscientious Southerner in 1963 knew that social ostracism would come down swiftly on a white person comforting a black person. If Martin Luther King wrote these things in 1963, would he have as much patience today with us, his fellow countrymen, if we refuse to see that racism is baked into our entire system of governance and history? In closing, let us think about tomorrow's holiday. Maybe we can take a few minutes to contemplate what it is we celebrate, why it is a holiday, and what that celebration calls us to do, to act on, and what promise it takes us to finally fulfill as a nation. Now, Johnny May will introduce our closing hymn, Amazing Grace.
Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace is one of the most beloved hymns of the last 2 centuries, estimated to be performed 10 million times a year and has been recorded in over 11,000 albums. It was mentioned in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and was written by John Newton, who, among many other incredible adventures, was an Anglican priest, a licentious libertine with a foul mouth, and a sailor and captain of slave trading ships. He wrote the hymn, one of 280 he composed, in 1772. But it wasn't until 1778, 34 years after leaving the slave trade, that he renounced his former slavery, his slave profession, with the pamphlet called Thoughts on the Slave Trade, which became enormously popular and influential in England. Newton apologized publicly for his part in the slave trade, saying, "It will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." Please rise in body or spirit and join us in singing Amazing Grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Johnny May will extinguish the chalice flame as we read these words. Quote, "Never, ever be afraid to do what's right, especially if the well-being of a person or animal is at stake. Society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our souls when we look the other way." Thank you. Go in peace and live in justice.